the Carolinas, Middle Colonies, and Georgia. Restoration. By 1640, English settlers in New England and around Chesapeake Bay had established two great beachheads on the Atlantic coast, with the Dutch colony of New Netherland in between. After 1640, however, the struggle between king and parliament in England diverted attention from colonization, and migration to America dwindled for more than 20 years. During the English Civil War, which was 1642 to 1651, and Oliver Cromwell's Puritan dictatorship, 1653 to 1658, the struggling colonies were left pretty much alone by the mother country. In 1643, Massachusetts Bay, Plymouth, Connecticut, and New Haven formed the New England Confederation to provide joint defense against the Dutch, French, and Indians. In some ways, the Confederation behaved like a nation unto itself. It made treaties, and in 1653 declared war against the Dutch, who were accused of inciting Indian attacks. Massachusetts, far from the scene of trouble, however failed to cooperate, greatly weakening the Confederation. Virginia and Maryland also defied Cromwell's dictatorship. Virginia burgesses, which were legislators, in 1649 denounced the Puritans' execution of King Charles and claimed that his son Charles II was the lawful king. The colony grew rapidly during these years of independent government before reverting to royal control when William Berkeley returned as governor in 1660 after the monarchy was restored in England. Cromwell allowed the colonies great flexibility, but was not indifferent to Britain's North American empire. He fought trade wars with the Dutch, and his navy harassed England's traditional enemy, Catholic Spain, in the Caribbean. In 1655, a British force wrestled Jamaica from Spanish control. The restoration of King Charles II in 1660 led to an equally painless reinstatement of previous governments in the colonies. Agents hastily dispatched by the colonies won confirmation of Massachusetts' charter in 1662 and the very first royal charters of Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1662 and 1663. All three remained self-governing corporations. Plymouth still had no charter, but it went unmolested. New Haven, however, was absorbed into Connecticut. The restoration of King Charles II revitalized interest among English for colonial expansion. Within 12 years, the English would conquer New Netherland and settle Carolina. In the middle region, formerly claimed by the Dutch, 4 new colonies emerged: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The new colonies were awarded to men who had remained loyal to the monarchy during the Civil War. In 1663, Charles II granted Carolina to 8 prominent supporters who became lords proprietor or owners of the region. The Carolinas. The southernmost mainland colony in the 17th century consisted of 2 widely separated areas that eventually became the 2 different Carolina colonies, North and South. The northernmost part, called Albemarle, had been settled in the 1650s by colonists from Virginia. For half a century, Albemarle remained an isolated cluster of farms along the shores of the Albemarle Sound. However, the focus of the 8 Lord Proprietor was placed upon the more promising sites in southern Carolina. To return a profit faster, they recruited experienced English planters from the tiny Caribbean island of Barbados, the oldest, richest, and most heavily populated colony in English America. The English in Barbados had developed a hugely profitable sugar plantation system based on the hard labor of enslaved Africans. The profitability of sugar plantations required a tremendous labor force. Due to the market for sugar, it turned out that buying slaves was the cheapest part of the endeavor, leading to masters working slaves to death and then buying replacements. It was cheaper to work a slave to death and buy another one than to necessarily maintain the ones already owned. Mortality rates for both slaves and even whites in Barbados was twice that of Virginia. By 1670, all available land on Barbados had been claimed, and the sons and grandsons of the planter elites were forced to look elsewhere to find estates of their own. So when colonists were recruited for South Carolina, and to bring the plantation system with them, many leaped at the chance happily. The first English colonists arrived in South Carolina in 1669 at Charlestown, later renamed Charleston. Over the next 20 years, half the South Carolina colonists were from Barbados and other island colonies in the Caribbean. With these conditions, it cannot be surprising that South Carolina was a slave-based colony from the start. Advertisements within Barbados newspapers, placed by the Carolina's sole proprietor, stated, "To the owner of every Negro man or slave brought hither to the Carolina within the first year 20 acres, and for every woman, Negro, or slave 10 acres, and all men, Negroes, and slaves after that time within the first 10 years, or 5 years, 10 acres, and for every woman, Negro, or slave 5. All of these resulted in an enormous amount of enslaved Africans being brought to the Carolinas to clear land, plant crops, and herd cattle." The unique document, the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, drafted by Lord Anthony Ashley Cooper with the help of his secretary John Locke, helped establish the colony's government. Its provisions for a formal titled nobility encouraged awarding large land grants to prominent Englishmen. From the beginning, head rights were given to every immigrant who could pay passage across the Atlantic. The Fundamental Constitutions granted religious tolerance, which gave Carolina a greater degree of religious freedom, even extending to Jews and heathens, than England or any other colony except Rhode Island. In 1712, Carolina colony was divided into two, North and South. After rebellion against the Lord Proprietors, South Carolina became a royal colony in 1719. North Carolina remained under their control until 1729. Rice became a dominant commercial crop in coastal South Carolina because of the ideal hot, humid, growing conditions. Rice, like sugarcane and tobacco, was a labor-intensive crop, making planters rely heavily on enslaved Africans. Both Carolinas also had huge forests of yellow pine trees that provided lumber and other key materials for shipbuilding. The sticky resin from pine trees could be boiled to make tar, which was needed to waterproof the seams of wooden ships. This is why North Carolinians came to be called Tar Heels. Now, enslaving Indians. One of the quickest ways to make money in the early years of Carolina's development was through trade with local native populations. In the late 17th century, English merchants began traveling southward from Virginia into the Piedmont region of Carolina, where they developed a prosperous commerce in deerskins with the Catawbs. Between 1699 and 1750, Carolina exported to England an average of 54,000 deerskins per year, where they would be transformed into leather gloves, belts, hats, work aprons, and bookbindings. As we've discussed previously concerning the French and the Dutch, the growing trade caused the Native Americans to enter into dependent relationships with the Europeans and proved disastrous for their traditional ways of life. English traders quickly became interested in buying enslaved Indians as well as deerskins. They gave Native Americans goods, firearms, and rum as payment for their captured rivals to be sold as slaves. The profitability of captive Indian workers prompted a frenzy of slaving activity among the English settlers. As many as 50,000 Native Americans, mostly women and children, were sold as slaves in Charlestown between 1670 and 1715. More enslaved Native Americans were exported during that period than Africans were imported, and thousands of others were sold to slavers who took them to the islands in the West Indies through New England ports. The growing trade triggered bitter struggles between rival Indian nations and helped ignite unprecedented colonial violence. In 1712, the Tuscaroras of North Carolina attacked German and English colonists who had encroached upon their land. North Carolina authorities appealed to Southern Carolina for aid, and the colony, eager for more slaves, dispatched two expeditions made up mostly of Indian allies: Yamassees, Cherokees, Creeks, and Choctaws. Catawbans. They destroyed a Tuscarora town, executed 162 male warriors, and took 392 women and children captives for sale in Charlestown, The surviving Tuscaroras fled north, where they joined the Iroquois. However, while the trouble began in North Carolina, the effects of the Tuscarora War sparked more conflict in South Carolina. The Yamasees felt betrayed when white traders paid them less for their Tuscarora captives than they wanted. What made this shortfall so acute was that the Yamasees owed debt to traders totaling 100,000 deerskins. To recover, white traders cheated Yamasees, confiscated their lands, and began enslaving their women and children. In April 1750, the enraged Yamasees attacked coastal plantations and killed more than 100 whites. The governor mobilized all white and black men to defend the colony. Other colonies supplied weapons, but it wasn't until the governor bribed the Cherokees to join them that the Yamasee War ended in 1770. The defeated Yamasees fled to Spanish-controlled Florida. By then, hundreds of whites had been killed and dozens of plantations destroyed and abandoned. To prevent another conflict, the colonial government outlawed all private trading with Native Americans. However, again, another domino effect, or what can be seen as a conflict vacuum. For the next 10 years or so, the Creeks and Cherokees engaged in costly blood feuds. Between 1700 and 1730, the indigenous population in the Carolinas dwindled from 15,000 to just 4,000. Now, the Middle Colonies in Georgia. The Middle Colonies would originally be controlled by the Netherlands. This would be New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Now, New Netherlands becoming New York. We have already gone over much of the history of New Netherlands with its profit-making enterprise trading in fur pelts. Originally at Fort Orange, later named Albany, Dutch traders brought Manhattan from Native Americans for 60 guilders, or roughly about $100,000 in current value. This purchase would result in the village of New Amsterdam, eventually New York City, and the capital of their colony, New Netherland. The settlement would become a refuge for everyone, particularly those seeking religious tolerance, Jews, for example. However, all the tolerances were purely profit-increasing. The eventual downfall of the colony was its strongest strength, trade. The Dutch dominated trade with China, India, Africa, Brazil, and the Caribbean, but could not control its empire in America. The troubles with wampum practically bankrupted the colony of New Netherland, and the English took advantage of it. The transfer of power was when a threatening English fleet showed up, and due to the diverse colonists, everyone but Governor Piet Stuyvesant was indifferent. The governor finally just surrendered the colony without firing a shot in 1664. The English conquest of New Netherlands had been led by James Stuart, Duke of York, who would become King James II. Upon the capture of New Amsterdam, his brother King Charles II granted the entire Dutch region to him. The Dutch, however, negotiated an unusual surrender agreement that allowed New Netherlands to retain their property, churches, language, and local officials. New Jersey. Shortly after the conquest of New Netherland, the Duke of York granted the lands between the Hudson and the Delaware rivers to Sir George Carteret and Lord John Berkeley, brother of Virginia's governor, and named the territory after Carteret's native Jersey, an island in the British Channel. In 1676, by mutual agreement, the new colony was divided into East and West Jersey, with Carteret taking the east and Berkeley taking the west. Finally, in 1682, Carteret sold out to a group of investors. New settlements gradually rose in New Jersey. Disaffected Puritans from New Haven founded Newark. Carteret's brother brought a group to found Elizabethtown, and a group of Scots founded Perth Amboy. In the west, facing the Delaware River, a scattering of Swedes, Finns, Dutch remained, but they were soon outnumbered by swarms of English and Welsh Quakers, as well as Germans and Scot-Irish settlers. In 1702, East and West Jersey would unite as a single royal colony of New Jersey. Pennsylvania. The Quakers, as the Friends of Society were called, became the most controversial of the radical religious groups that emerged from the tumultuous English Civil War. Founded in England in 1647 by George Fox, the Friends rebelled against all forms of political and religious authority, including salaried ministers, military service, and paying taxes. They insisted that everyone, not just a few, could experience God's free gospel, a personal revelation from God, what they called the inner light of the Holy Spirit. Further beliefs stated that people were essentially good and could achieve salvation through personal, emotional communion with God, and demanded that complete religious freedom for everyone. To further rebel against convention, Quakers promoted equality of the sexes, including full participation of women in religious affairs. As you can see, their beliefs were completely different than those of Puritans and others in Europe, often resulting in violent abuse towards them, even going as far as torture and execution. They were hated, especially for their refusal to acknowledge the supremacy of the Puritanism. However, martyrdom was looked upon favorably. For example, was Mary Dyer, former follower of Anne Hutchinson. She was eventually hanged by the Massachusetts Puritans for protesting the anti-Quaker laws and coming back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The settlers of English Quakers in West Jersey encouraged other Friends to migrate, especially to the Delaware River side of the colony, where William Penn's Quaker Commonwealth, the colony of Pennsylvania, soon arose. Penn was the son of wealthy Admiral Sir William Penn, and had attended Oxford University, from which he was expelled for criticizing the university's requirement that students attend daily chapel services. His furious father banished his rebellious son from his home. Penn would then move and study in France before moving to Ireland to manage the family's estate. There, the 22-year-old was arrested in 1666 for attending a Quaker meeting. He would become a Quaker, much to his parents' disapproval, and arrested several more times for his religious convictions. Upon his father's death, Penn inherited a fortune, including a large tract of land in America. At the king's urging, wanting to rid England of Quakers, Penn migrated and called the land Pennsylvania at the request of the king. It literally means Penn's Wood and is named after his father. The extent of the land was even larger than England itself. Penn would aggressively encourage people from different religions and from different countries to settle in his new colony, believing everyone could live in harmony. By the end of 1681, thousands of immigrants would respond to the offer, and a bustling town emerged at the junctions of Schuylkill and Delaware rivers. Penn would call this Philadelphia, meaning the city of brotherly love. The relationship between Native Americans and the Pennsylvania Quakers was unusually good because of the Quakers' friendliness and Penn's policy of purchasing land titles from the Native Americans. For 50 years, the two parties lived in peace. The colony's government, which was established by 3 frames of government drafted by Penn, resembled that of other proprietary colonies, except that freemen elected the council members as well as the assembly. The governor had no veto, although Penn, as proprietor, did. Penn hoped that peace and order could be maintained by the accordance of Quaker principles. However, over time, the Quakers would struggle with harmonious colony, and in the first 10 years, it went through 6 governors. Delaware. In 1682, the Duke of York granted Penn the area of Delaware. This would be former Dutch territory, and it was originally, before the Dutch acquired it in 1655, New Sweden. The name of Delaware River is what gave Delaware its name. It was in honor of Thomas West, Baron Delaware. Delaware was Virginia's first colonial governor. The area was originally part of Pennsylvania, but it was granted the right to choose its own assembly after 1704. Until after the Revolution, it would have its own separate assembly but shared Pennsylvania's governor. Georgia would be the last English colony. 1732, King George II gave land between Savannah and the Mata Rivers to 21 English trustees, who appointed a governor of the province of Georgia. The uniqueness about Georgia is that it served two purposes. The first was to provide a military buffer protecting the Carolinas from Spanish-controlled Florida, but mainly it was to serve as a social experiment, bringing together settlers from different countries and religions, as well as many refugees, debtors, or miserable wretches made up of worthy poor. The head of the colony would be General James E. Oglethorpe. Savannah would be founded in 1733 and designed by Oglethorpe himself. It was a featured grid of crisscross roads graced by numerous parks. Protestant refugees were the first from Austria beginning to arrive in 1734. They would be followed by Germans and German-speaking Moravians and Swiss. From there, you had Welsh, Highland Scots, Sephardic Jews, and others that would come. The buffer state succeeded, however, the social experiment part failed. Initially limiting land holdings to 500 acres, liquor being banned, lawyers being banned, and importation of slaves forbidden, it proved that no one really followed the rules. Regulations on Roman slavery were widely disregarded and finally abandoned. It would become a royal colony in 1754 and develop slowly until 1763. Georgia's major exports would be rice, lumber, beef, and pork, and they would establish a profitable trade with the islands and West Indies. It would become an economic success and a slave-centered society. Now, the native populations were the English settlers. The English strategy for dealing with Native Americans deviated extensively from that of the French and the Dutch. Merchants from France and Netherlands focused on exploiting the profitable fur trade that helped spur exploration of the vast American continent. This strategy both enriched and devastated the lives of Native Americans. In order to penetrate the rich fur trade in upper New York and along the Great Lakes, the French and Dutch established good relations with the majority of the native tribes, even going as far as to support some of their allies in war. The English colonies, in contrast, were more interested in the pursuing of their God-given right to hunt and farm on Indian lands and to fish in Indian waters without regard of ownership, communal ideology, and fair compensation. If it sounds like the makings of Manifest Destiny, which we will discuss towards the end of the semester, you would be right. Native Americans who fought to keep their land were forced out or killed. New England Puritans, like Virginian colonists, thought Native Americans were demonic savages who had no business being in New England or any of the other colonies. Now, the Pequot War. In 1636, settlers in Massachusetts first accused a Pequot of murdering a colonist. The English took revenge by burning a Pequot village. As the people fled, the Puritans killed them, men, women, and children. Sassacus, the Pequot chief, organized the survivors and counterattacked. During the ensuing Pequot War of 1637, the colonists and the Narragansett allies set fire to the Indian village near the West Mystic in the Connecticut Valley and killed those who tried to escape. William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth, admitted that it was a horrible sight to witness, but the victory was a sweet sacrifice delivered to God. Eventually, the Pequot were conquered. Under the terms of the Treaty of Hartford, 1638, the Pequot nation was dissolved. Refugees fled in all directions. Sassacus escaped to the Mohawks in New York, with whom he pleaded to spare his life. They did not. In fact, they sent his scalp to the English as a peace offering. King Philip's War. After the Pequot War, relations between Native Americans and colonists improved somewhat. But the increasing influx of English settlers and the decline of the beaver population eventually reduced Native Americans to poverty. By 1675, both sides had come to fear the other deeply. The era of somewhat peaceful coexistence came to a bloody end during the last quarter of the 17th century. Native American leaders, especially the chief of the Wampagons, Metacomet, known by the colonists as King Philip, resented English efforts to convert Indians to Christianity. In the fall of 1674, John Sassamon, a Christian Indian who had graduated from Harvard College, warned the English that the Wampagons were preparing for war. A few months later, he was found dead in a frozen pond. Colonial authorities convicted and hanged 3 Wampagons for murder, which enraged the Wampanoag warriors, who then burned Puritan farms on June 20, 1675. 3 days later, an Englishman shot a Wampagon, which resulted in retaliation further by the Wampagons, who ambushed and beheaded a group of Puritans. Atrocities from both sides spiraled out of control in a brutal war that would be referred to as King Philip's War or Metacomet's War. The fighting resulted in more deaths and destruction in New England, in proportion to the population, than any American conflict since, that including the Civil War. Vengeful bands of warriors destroyed 12 towns and attacked 40 more. Within a year, colonists conducted a surprise attack that killed 300 Narragansett warriors and 400 women and children. Now do not ask me why they go after their Narragansett allies, but they did. The Narragansett retaliated by destroying Providence, Rhode Island, and threatening Boston. The situation grew so desperate that the colonies passed America's first conscription laws, drafting into the militia all males between the ages of 16 and 60. In the summer of 1676, Metacomet's wife and only son were captured. In the end, staggering casualties and shortage of food and ammunition bore down the Narragansetts. Some surrendered, many succumbed to disease, and others fled to the west. Those who remained were forced into villages supervised by English officials. Metacomet initially escaped, only to be hunted down and killed. As for his wife and son, they were sold into slavery in the Caribbean. By the end of King Philip's War, 3/4 of the Indians in New England had been killed. Further Native American relations was that of the Iroquois League. The same combination of forces that wiped out the Indian populations in New England and the Carolinas affected native peoples of New York City and the lower Hudson Valley. The inability of Indian groups to unite effectively against the Europeans, as well as their vulnerability to infectious diseases, doomed them to conquest and exploitation. However, in the interior of New York, a different situation arose. Sometime before 1600, the Iroquois nations Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and the Mohawk had been convinced by another Mohawk to form an allegiance, the Iroquois League, also known to its members as the Great Peace. It became so strong that the outnumbered Dutch and later English traders were forced to work with them to acquire beaver pelts. By the early 17th century, a council of some 50 Shoshims, or chieftains, oversaw 12,000 members. Its capital was Onondaga, a bustling town a few miles south of what would later become Syracuse, New York. The League was governed by the Great Law of Peace, which had 3 main principles: peace, equality, and justice. Each person was to be a shareholder in the wealth of the nation. The Constitution established a great council of 50 men, which were religious political leaders, each representing one of the female-led clans of the Iroquois nations. The Great Law of Peace gave essential powers to the people and insisted that every time the religious political leaders dealt with an especially important matter or emergency, they had to submit the matter to the decision of the people, both men and women, for their consent. The search for furs and captives led the Iroquois parties to range widely across eastern North America. They gained control over the huge area from the St. Lawrence River to Tennessee and from Maine to Michigan. For more than 20 years, warfare raged across the Great Lakes region between the Iroquois and the Algonquins and Hurons. In the 1690s, the French and their Indian allies destroyed Iroquois crops and villages, infected them with smallpox, and reduced the male population by more than a third. Facing extermination, the Iroquois made peace with the French in 1701, staying out of the constant conflict between France and England, while playing the English off the French and creating a thriving fur trade for themselves. Now, slavery in North America. Here are just a little bit of stats. By 1700, there was 11% of the total population that were enslaved Africans. By 1770, that would jump up to 20 or more percent of the total population. There would be regional differences, of course. Africans were a tiny minority in New England, which was composed of only around 2% of the population. This would be due to no large plantations. Slavery would be prominent within the Chesapeake colonies and the Carolinas. In 1730, the black populations in Virginia and Maryland would become self-sustaining and grown population, meaning most of them would be born in the U.S. By 1750, 80% of the Chesapeake Bay region was born in the colonies. Slavery in North America was horrific. These slaves would be treated like chattel, quartered in barracks, fed like livestock, ill-fitted clothing, and uncomfortable shoes, to the point that many would go barefoot. For any infraction or punishment, they would be whipped, branded, shackled, castrated, or sold to the worst part of the Caribbean. Now, slaves didn't just pop up on North American shores. They were brought over by Africa, and in fact, slavery has an African root. More than 10 million individuals would be enslaved and make the journey to the Western Hemisphere. Vast majority of them would go to the Portuguese Brazil or Caribbean sugar islands. The Atlantic and to the American would be the largest transportation of forced migration in history. The demographics of the African slaves would be roughly about 50 different languages, all of them worshiping different gods from all different walks of life. Some would be from small villages all the way up to cities. The practice would come from the African common practice of warfare, where rival tribes would conquer, kidnap, enslave, and sell one another. Slavery, however, was different in Africa than it was in America. Slaves in Africa would live with their captors, and children were not automatically enslaved. Now, how did Africans get to North America? Well, what would happen is that first, once they were captured, the Africans then would be taken to slave forts. They used to be forts along the West African coast. Generally, every single European country would have one. Some of them would be Sweden, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Netherlands, and Portugal. After several days to several weeks, these captured Africans were then tunneled underground to waiting ships owned by European slave traders. They'd then be purchased, branded on the back or buttocks with the company mark, chained, and then loaded up. Most of them, surprisingly enough, were owned by British slave traders. Now, the Middle Passage. I'm sure all of you have heard it. This passage was a journey that was about between 4 weeks to 6 months transatlantic. The middle leg of the triangle trade was that of America. The first leg would be in West Africa in exchange for rum, clothing, guns, slaves. The second leg would be the American ports. What they would do is they would unload the slaves and then reload with commodities and timber. Then, once they were all loaded up, they would make the third leg of the trip, which was back to Europe. The Middle Passage was rough. 1 in 6 African captives died in the Middle Passage. Slave revolts were not uncommon. and the conditions were horrific. They would literally be packed in like sardines, all the way from the bottom to the top. Slavery, even though it was extremely dangerous, was also a highly respectable position or job. Now these were the English colonies. They were actually pretty thriving. In the early 18th century, there was both positives and negatives, of course. The positives were that Britain would actually outstrip colonies of France and Spain. They would control much of the continental America as well as the Caribbean. Most of them would be very populous, prosperous, and powerful, such as the New England colonies, and colonists were tended to be better fed, clothed, and housed than their European counterparts. Some of the negatives, however, was that colonial life was very hard. Colonists found hard labor, desperation, early death, as we talked about in the next module, is that mortality rates were high. Survival often required exploitation of indentured servants, slaves, and native populations. Now, in comparison between English colonies and the other Europeans, was a little bit of a difference. England was organized by profit-making enterprises with minimum royal control, only to grant royal charters, while the other Europeans were very tight-controlled government, stifling innovation. Most of the other Europeans were actually sponsored by the royal crown itself. The English, because of the minimum royal control, had the greatest degree of self-governance. Colonists generally tended to stay in America, as opposed to the other European countries, such as New Spain. New Spain was dominated by wealthy men with vast estates, and they often returned to Spain. Catholics were the only ones really welcomed by other European empires, or at least it was religion by religion. Dutch and non-Puritan English were a little bit more welcoming of people, religious and ethnic tolerance. Now the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay were very strict and they didn't approve of anybody, but you would find more acceptance with English or Dutch controlled English locations than you did in any other colony. Just a little bit of location. Here is the English colonies. So you have the New England states, which are New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut. Then you have the middle, which is New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. And then the southern colonies, which is going to be Maryland all the way down to Georgia. These settlements are going to be extremely concentrated. So you have the eastern slopes of the Appalachian Mountains to the east coast. You had a lot of trade, commerce, while the ocean served as a highway for transportation of people, idea, commerce, and ways of life from Europe. The ocean served as a barrier to separate old ideas from the new, allowing more autonomy.